Olivia Grant was a woman on the rise, 28, intelligent, striking, and fiercely ambitious. She had worked tirelessly to carve out her place in the competitive world of law, leaving behind her modest upbringing in the quiet suburbs. Now, in the glittering world of high society, she had everything she ever dreamed of: prestige, admiration, and the promise of a future filled with success. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment she crossed paths with Victor Grant. Victor, 43, was the embodiment of power and influence. As CEO of his own manufacturing empire, he was the kind of man whose presence commanded attention. His tailored suits, silver-streaked hair, and confident demeanor spoke of wealth that radiated from every inch of him. But there was a distance in his eyes, a hidden emptiness that he carefully concealed beneath layers of charm and cold professionalism. It was at a lavish charity gala in San Francisco that their worlds collided. Olivia, a rising star in the legal world, was immediately drawn to Victor's magnetic presence, his ability to make everyone around him feel like they were the center of the universe. He, in turn, was captivated by her beauty, her wit, and the sharp intelligence that seemed to cut through the superficial chatter of the evening. Their connection was immediate, electric. Within weeks, Victor was showering Olivia with extravagant gifts, designer bags, jewelry, and weekends at luxury resorts. The world of opulence and luxury that he lived in was suddenly within her grasp, and Olivia reveled in it. She was no longer the girl from a middle-class background, she was Victor Grant's woman now, and the world at his side seemed perfect. By the time their whirlwind romance had reached its fever pitch, Victor proposed. The ring he slipped on her finger was so large it could have paid off her student loans twice over. Olivia said yes, her heart pounding with the kind of joy she had never known. Their wedding in 2016 was the event of the season in Maplewood, a picturesque town in Northern California that had long been a symbol of quiet wealth. The church was packed with the town's most influential people, and Olivia walked down the aisle in a custom-made designer gown, her face glowing under the soft lights, the picture of a woman who had it all. But as the applause faded and the world looked on, no one could have known how quickly their fairy tale would begin to unravel. The first year of marriage passed with the ease of a dream. Olivia left her high-powered legal job in San Francisco to devote herself fully to her role as the perfect society wife. She threw herself into charity work, hosted lavish dinner parties, and attended every event that required her presence. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Yet, behind the facade of marital bliss, cracks were beginning to appear. Slowly, imperceptibly, Victor's controlling nature began to rear its ugly head. What had started as a protective instinct gradually became suffocating. Olivia, who had once been independent and confident, now found herself second-guessing every decision she made. She was no longer allowed the freedom she once took for granted. Her once vibrant personality began to dim under the weight of his expectations. The life she had so eagerly embraced was becoming a gilded cage. It wasn't just the growing tension in their marriage that began to affect Olivia, it was the creeping sense of isolation. In this world of wealth and influence, where everyone wore masks of politeness, Olivia found herself utterly alone. She longed to rekindle her legal career, to find something of herself outside of Victor's shadow, but that was out of the question. Victor vehemently opposed the idea, insisting she had no need to work. Her arguments became more frequent, her silences longer, and with each passing day, she felt herself sinking deeper into a life she no longer recognized. It was in this quiet desperation that Ethan Grant would arrive, unknowingly setting the stage for a series of events that would lead to a shocking, tragic end. The arrival of Ethan Grant in the summer of 2017 was the spark that would ignite the slow-burning tension in the Grant household. It was a quiet evening when Olivia first heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, a sound that should have been ordinary, but somehow felt different. Ethan had come home. Ethan, Victor's 18-year-old son from his previous marriage, had spent most of his life in the shadow of his father's towering presence, a presence that had been a constant source of resentment for him. After a tumultuous year at college, marked by academic probation and a stint in rehab for alcohol abuse, Ethan found himself with no other options. His mother, Marissa, had struggled with addiction for years, and Victor, who had full custody of him as a child, had sent him off to boarding schools and kept him at arm's length. Now, at 18, Ethan had nowhere left to turn but back to Victor and the gilded cage of Maplewood. Victor, ever the authoritarian, made it clear that Ethan had two choices: come home, work for the family company, and get his life together, or be cut off entirely. With no prospects and a bitter taste of rebellion still fresh in his mouth, Ethan grudgingly agreed to return, the weight of his past failures and the pressure of his father's ultimatum hanging over him. When Ethan stepped into the house, it felt like a shift in the atmosphere. The walls of the Grant home, which had once felt secure and luxurious, now seemed suffocating. Ethan's tall frame, his eyes darkened by past pain and betrayal, was a stark contrast to the perfect, polished world that Olivia had grown accustomed to. His presence seemed to unsettle everything, from the delicate balance of power that Victor held over Olivia to the carefully curated image of a happy family. The first meeting between Olivia and Ethan after all these years was anything but cordial. Olivia remembered him only as the sullen 14-year-old boy she had met briefly at her wedding, but now he was different, hardened by life's disappointments and the neglect that came with being raised by a father who was more focused on work than his own flesh and blood. He barely acknowledged her at first, offering only a nod before retreating to his room, his rebellious attitude as strong as ever. Ethan was placed into the family company by Victor, starting at the bottom, doing menial work at the factory, learning the business from the ground up. It was an arrangement that was supposed to teach him discipline, but in reality, it only deepened the rift between father and son. Ethan resented the way his father tried to control his every move, imposing his authority with an iron fist. Victor's rules were clear: work hard, stay out of trouble, and be grateful for the opportunities he was given. But Ethan could not shake the feeling that, no matter what he did, it would never be enough for the man who never truly loved him. As days turned into weeks, Olivia found herself increasingly drawn to Ethan's presence. There was something about him, his rebellious energy, his rawness, that was a sharp contrast to Victor's cold, controlled demeanor. In Ethan, Olivia saw the freedom she had longed for in her own life, a freedom that seemed just out of reach as she continued to play the role of the perfect wife, the perfect society hostess. The more time Olivia spent around Ethan, the more she felt the magnetic pull of his youthful energy. Ethan, for his part, began to notice Olivia in a way he hadn't before. Gone was the woman in her 20s, eager to please, eager to fit into the mold Victor had created for her. Instead, he saw a woman whose eyes were haunted by the weight of her unspoken frustrations, a woman who seemed just as trapped as he was, but in a different, more insidious way. Their interactions, at first awkward and brief, began to stretch into longer conversations. There were stolen moments at the breakfast table, a quiet exchange of glances when Victor wasn't looking, a subtle understanding that passed between them, though neither dared to speak it aloud. Olivia saw in Ethan a reflection of her own pain. His resentment toward his father mirrored her growing dissatisfaction with her life. One evening, as summer stretched on and the oppressive heat hung thick in the air, something shifted between them. Victor was away on business, and the house felt unusually empty. Olivia, unable to sleep in the stifling heat, ventured downstairs for a glass of water. It was then that she found Ethan in the kitchen, shirtless and glistening with sweat after a late-night run. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a long moment, the silence between them was palpable. The air was thick with something unspoken, something electric. Ethan's gaze softened as he noticed the exhaustion in Olivia's eyes, and for the first time, she saw in him a vulnerability that mirrored her own. They began talking, about the heat, about their lives, about the emptiness they both felt despite their outward success. As the hours slipped away, their conversation turned deeper. Ethan opened up about his struggles, his feelings of abandonment by both parents, his failed attempts to fit into the life Victor had imposed on him. Olivia, in turn, confessed the isolation she had come to feel in her marriage to Victor, the stifling pressure of always being the perfect wife. That night, they shared a connection that neither of them had anticipated. The attraction between them, buried beneath layers of guilt and longing, flared into something undeniable. But they both knew the consequences of what had just transpired. Their feelings, though unspoken, had been laid bare in the quiet, vulnerable moments of the night. The next morning, they tried to brush it off as a moment of weakness, a passing connection that meant nothing. But the tension between them only grew, their glances longer, their touches more lingering. Neither could deny the pull they felt toward each other, and though they tried to resist, the attraction continued to simmer beneath the surface, threatening to explode into something neither of them could control. In the months that followed that fateful night in the kitchen, Olivia and Ethan's bond deepened in ways neither of them could have predicted. The air between them grew thick with unspoken words, and the careful distance they had once maintained seemed impossible to uphold. Every moment they shared, every fleeting touch or lingering glance, pushed them further into dangerous territory, and neither could escape the intoxicating pull they felt toward each other. It started with the smallest of gestures. At dinner, their eyes would meet across the table, and for just a moment, the world outside their little bubble would fade away. When they spoke, their words were laced with meaning that no one else could understand. Ethan would smile at her with a knowing look, a quiet acknowledgement of the secret that existed between them. Olivia, on the other hand, began to crave his presence, a craving she tried desperately to suppress but found impossible to ignore. Victor, ever the oblivious patriarch, remained immersed in his work, caught up in the facade of family unity that Olivia and Ethan so carefully maintained. He was content in his delusion that all was well, but the truth was, the house was filled with a tension so palpable, even the walls seemed to sigh with it. The once pristine, perfect life Olivia had created was beginning to crack, and she felt herself teetering on the edge. Their encounters were still fleeting, still under the cover of secrecy, but each one seemed to draw them closer to the point of no return. Ethan's presence in the house became harder to ignore. His sharp wit, his rebellious energy, and the raw, unfiltered emotions he wore like armor were a stark contrast to Victor's cold control and Olivia's passive acceptance. Ethan represented everything Olivia had once yearned for: freedom, passion, excitement, and the more she allowed herself to indulge in his company, the harder it became to resist. In the quiet moments, when Victor was away on business or off with his colleagues, Olivia would find herself stealing glances at Ethan when he wasn't looking. He had become a part of her daily routine, whether it was an accidental brush of hands in the hallway or a conversation that lingered too long in the living room. It was during these stolen moments that she began to realize just how far gone she was. Her heart raced when he spoke to her, and the very air seemed to hum with energy when they were in the same room. Every glance exchanged, every breath caught between them, felt like a promise, one that neither of them dared to acknowledge out loud. It wasn't long before the physical tension between them reached a boiling point. One evening, as the moonlight filtered through the curtains of the living room, Olivia found herself standing in the doorway, watching Ethan as he sat on the couch, engrossed in his thoughts. He looked so vulnerable, so unlike the confident, defiant young man he had been when he first walked into her life. His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, and in that moment, all pretense vanished. Without thinking, Olivia crossed the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm in a gentle caress, as if drawn by an invisible force. Ethan turned his face toward her, his expression unreadable. He didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned into her touch, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The silence between them was deafening, but neither of them spoke a word. Then, without warning, their lips met, tentative at first, as if neither knew what to expect. But the moment their mouths collided, a fire ignited between them, hot, urgent, and impossible to ignore. Olivia's hands found their way to his chest, her fingers trembling as they slid beneath his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin. Ethan responded in kind, his hands tracing the curves of her body as if memorizing every inch. What followed was a desperate rush of passion. It was reckless, impulsive, everything they had denied each other for so long. They were no longer just a stepmother and stepson, but two people caught in a whirlwind of emotion, bound by a desire so intense that it threatened to consume them both. Their lovemaking was frantic, as if they both knew the enormity of what they were doing, but neither of them cared. In that moment, it was as if the world outside ceased to exist. The weight of their actions, the consequences, didn't matter. When it was over, the silence that followed was suffocating. Olivia lay there, her chest heaving, her mind racing, trying to reconcile the feelings of euphoria with the overwhelming sense of guilt that followed. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Ethan, too, lay next to her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the gravity of what had just transpired. But the look in his eyes said everything. The days that followed were a blur. Every interaction between them felt charged, as if the very air crackled with the tension they had created. They tried to act normal, tried to pretend that nothing had happened. But they both knew it was a lie. The attraction had been unleashed, and it couldn't be contained again. They continued to share stolen moments, each one more daring than the last. A touch here, a glance there, a shared laugh over breakfast, a lingering conversation in the hallway. But with every secret rendezvous, every stolen kiss, came the weight of what they were risking. Olivia began to question herself. Was this really love, or was it just a desperate escape from a life she had grown to resent? Ethan, too, struggled with his feelings. Was he truly in love with her, or was this simply a twisted act of rebellion against a father he had never been able to connect with? The more they indulged in their affair, the more reckless they became. Their once innocent interactions turned into passionate, secret meetings in the most unlikely places, inside locked rooms, behind closed doors, anywhere they could steal a few moments alone. And as the months dragged on, the affair consumed them both, leaving them both tangled in a web of lies and deception. The guilt they once felt began to fade, replaced by an insatiable hunger for each other. And though they both knew it was only a matter of time before their secret would be exposed, neither of them could bring themselves to stop. As autumn approached, with its crisp winds and falling leaves, Olivia and Ethan's relationship had become an uncontrollable force, one that neither of them could escape, no matter how hard they tried. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and with it, the path to destruction was set in motion. The passion between Olivia and Ethan had spiraled into a dangerous obsession, but the intoxicating pull of their forbidden relationship was no longer enough to silence the growing desperation they both felt. It was clear to Olivia that her life, the life she had built with Victor, was suffocating her. Victor had become a shadow in her existence, his controlling nature, his disregard for her emotional needs, and his oppressive authority over her made her feel as though she were drowning. Ethan, too, felt trapped in the grip of his father's relentless expectations. For years, Victor had demanded obedience and respect, forcing Ethan to live a life dictated by a man who had never truly seen him as anything more than an extension of himself. The truth had slowly settled between them, heavy and undeniable. There was only one way out. There was only one way to escape the iron grip of Victor Grant. They would have to kill him. The idea began to take root in Olivia's mind like a seed planted in the dark recesses of her heart, watered by the constant ache of her dissatisfaction. She had long harbored a quiet resentment toward Victor's arrogance, but now, with Ethan by her side, that resentment had transformed into something far darker. The death of Victor would not only free her from her gilded cage, it would also open up the possibility of a life with Ethan, one where they could be together without the constraints of family or societal judgment. But there was more to it than just love. There was also the lure of money, the life insurance policy Victor had taken out years ago, with Olivia named as the sole beneficiary. That money would grant her the independence she craved, the freedom to live a life that had been denied to her for so long. Ethan, despite his deep emotional conflict, was convinced. He had suffered enough under the rule of his father. He had been humiliated, neglected, and abandoned by the man who was supposed to love him. Victor's oppressive presence had been a constant weight in Ethan's life, and the thought of being free from it, free from his father's shadow, was something he couldn't resist. It would be a final act of revenge, one that would sever the last tie binding him to the man who had never understood him. The plan, however, would not be simple. They knew that if they were to succeed, they would have to be meticulous, careful, and most importantly, patient. Olivia and Ethan began to lay the groundwork, each step calculated and precise. They knew that if they were to kill Victor, they would need to make it appear like an accident or suicide, something that would evade suspicion. It had to be perfect, seamless, without a trace of foul play. Victor, ever the workaholic, spent most of his time away on business trips, leaving Olivia and Ethan alone in the house. This provided them with ample opportunity to execute their plan. Their first step was to subtly poison Victor over a period of time, to weaken him without raising alarm. Olivia, in her role as the perfect wife, began to prepare his meals with an added dose of sedatives, just enough to make him drowsy, just enough to lower his defenses without being detected. Ethan helped her with the planning, providing support when Olivia questioned her own resolve. He pushed her to take the necessary steps, assuring her that this was the only way forward. The days passed in a haze of secrecy. Olivia's once pristine image as a devoted wife began to fade, replaced by a woman who was desperately counting the days until Victor's demise. She felt like a stranger in her own home, her mind consumed with the weight of her actions. She had convinced herself that she was doing this for her own survival, for a life that she could never have with Victor alive. And yet, each day, she found herself more conflicted. The guilt clawed at her insides, but the hunger for freedom was stronger. As Victor began to grow increasingly lethargic, his health seemed to deteriorate without explanation. He complained of headaches, dizziness, and a general feeling of fatigue. Olivia feigned concern, offering him the usual reassurance that everything would be fine. She told him that it was just stress, just the pressure of his work. But the truth was, the sedatives were slowly working their magic, dulling his senses and making him less aware of the subtle changes in his environment. Ethan, meanwhile, was becoming more and more impatient. He had watched Olivia struggle with the plan, torn between the desire for freedom and the guilt of what they were about to do. Ethan, however, was ready. He had no qualms about the act of murder, it was simply the necessary means to an end. Victor's death would not only mean freedom for Olivia, it would mean the end of the constant battle for his own sense of self. The anger and resentment that had built up over the years would finally be washed away. The night they had chosen for the final act arrived with chilling precision. Victor was scheduled to leave for another business trip, a routine he followed religiously. This time, however, there would be no return. As he packed his things in the study, Olivia prepared one last meal, a dinner laced with the powerful sedative that would render him unconscious. Ethan stood by, silent and watchful, knowing that soon, they would take the final step. Olivia watched Victor eat, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the drug slowly take effect. She had been so careful with the dosage, but now the reality of what they were doing was settling in. Was this really the only way? Was there no other way to escape the cage she had built? But it was too late for doubt. Ethan had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back. As Victor began to nod off, his body slackening, Olivia exchanged a brief look with Ethan. It was time. They had prepared for this moment, but now that it had arrived, the weight of their actions pressed down on them like an unbearable burden. The final step of their plan was simple but deadly. Victor's gun, a weapon he kept in his study, would be used to stage his death as a suicide. The perfect final act. But as the clock ticked down and they stood in the quiet darkness of their own making, neither Olivia nor Ethan could have known just how quickly things would spiral out of control. The night had fallen silent around the Grant house, but inside, a storm was brewing. Olivia's pulse raced as she moved around the kitchen, preparing Victor's final meal. Every motion felt heavy, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. The sedative she had slipped into his dinner was already taking effect, and as she glanced toward the study, she could see Victor moving slower, more sluggish. His eyes were starting to droop, a telltale sign that he was succumbing to the drug's effect. Ethan stood in the hallway, his heart pounding with anticipation. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no going back. He could hear the soft shuffle of Victor's steps in the study as he prepared for his usual late-night ritual of paperwork. But tonight, everything would change. Tonight, Victor Grant would never make it to his next business trip. Victor had been a pillar of control in the household for so long. His steely, commanding presence was what had kept everyone in line, what had kept Olivia trapped in a gilded cage. But now, the man who had built his empire on dominance and ruthless precision was finally slipping. Olivia couldn't help but feel a strange mix of triumph and guilt. She had always believed she deserved better, that she had been more than just a trophy wife, but in this moment, the cost of her freedom seemed unbearable. Yet, she couldn't turn back now. They had come too far. As the night grew late, Victor finished his meal, his usual sharpness dulling with each bite. Olivia stood across the room, watching him as he sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes in exhaustion. He was becoming disoriented, his eyelids heavy as the sedative worked its magic. Ethan, unable to sit still, paced by the window, eyes darting between the clock and the door. The moment was closing in. But just as they thought their plan was flawless, the sound of tires screeching on the gravel driveway froze them both in place. A car. Returning unexpectedly. Olivia's heart stopped. It was Victor. She had been so sure of his departure that she hadn't even thought about the possibility of him coming home early. Panic flooded her body, and in that instant, she knew their carefully orchestrated plan was in jeopardy. She locked eyes with Ethan, and they both realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Victor was home, and everything was about to come crashing down. The door to the house creaked open, and Olivia's breath hitched. She quickly turned and made her way toward the kitchen, desperately trying to act casual, trying to play the part of the dutiful wife. But the cold sweat on her palms told a different story. She could hear Victor's footsteps as he entered the house, his heavy boots echoing in the foyer. "Olivia?" His voice rang out, sharp and demanding. "Where are you?" Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. She had no time to hide the evidence of their plan. Quickly, she wiped her hands on a dish towel, trying to steady her nerves. Her mind raced, desperately thinking of what to do next. "I'm in the kitchen, Victor," she called back, her voice trembling slightly. "Just making sure everything's in order." Victor appeared in the doorway, his face slightly flushed from the alcohol he had consumed earlier that evening. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. "You didn't expect me back this early, did you?" he asked, a slight smirk forming on his lips. "A little too quiet around here, don't you think?" Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to maintain her composure. But then she saw the look in his eyes, something was off. His gaze was sharper than usual, more focused. And in that instant, she realized the truth, something had tipped him off. He had been suspicious of her. Of them. He knew something was wrong. Victor stepped forward, crossing the room with purpose. He didn't even acknowledge the food on the table or the empty glass. Instead, his eyes locked onto Olivia. "I've been listening," he said slowly, his voice a low growl. "I know what you've been doing." The word struck Olivia like a punch to the gut. Her breath hitched, and she felt her stomach twist in knots. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Victor, Olivia started, but she was cut off as Victor stepped closer, his hand shooting out to grab her arm with unexpected force. "You think I don't know?" His grip tightened, his voice rising. You and Ethan. All these late nights. The whispers. The lies. Olivia's mind raced, and panic threatened to take over. She glanced at Ethan, who stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. But it was too late. There was no running now. The truth had been exposed. Victor turned his attention to Ethan, his face contorting with rage. You, my own son, he spat, his voice thick with disgust. How dare you betray me like this? Ethan's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of his father's fury, and despite the months of anger he had held inside, there was a part of him that still felt the sting of betrayal. He had never asked for this life. He had never wanted to hurt his father, but the years of neglect, the cruelty, had pushed him to this point. Now, the man who had caused all his pain was standing before him, seething with rage. Victor lunged toward Ethan, his hands raised in anger. You're nothing. You're just like your mother, he shouted, his fury boiling over. Olivia screamed, but it was too late. In the split second that followed, the chaos erupted. Victor, in his blind rage, swung his fist at Ethan. But Ethan was faster. He dodged the blow and shoved his father back with all the strength he could muster. The force of the push sent Victor stumbling back into the glass table, shattering it on impact. The room erupted into chaos. Shards of glass littered the floor, and in the frenzy, Victor reached for the heavy ashtray on the table, his hand trembling with rage. He swung it at Ethan, but in the blink of an eye, Ethan grabbed the weapon, his mind clouded by fear and anger. The ashtray connected with Victor's skull in a sickening crack. Victor crumpled to the floor, his body falling limp in a heap. His breath became shallow, and blood began to pool around him. Olivia rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to stem the flow of blood. But it was too late. Victor Grant, the man who had ruled their lives with an iron fist, was gone. The sound of police sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as they neared the house. Olivia sat back, her hands covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of her husband. She looked at Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. The confrontation was over. The plan had worked, but in the chaos that followed, neither of them could have predicted how quickly everything would unravel. The truth was out. And nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Victor's death were a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and questions that Olivia wasn't ready to answer. The Grant house, once a symbol of power and success, now felt like a crime scene, cold, lifeless, and shattered. Detective Lucas Hayes stood in the doorway, his stern eyes scanning the room as forensic teams combed through the wreckage. The air was thick with tension, as every detail would be scrutinized, every lie exposed. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to maintain her composure, but inside, her mind raced, constantly replaying the events that had led to this moment. Victor's body had been removed from the pool house, and the once lavish home now felt like a tomb. The aftermath of the bloody confrontation had left its mark on Olivia in more ways than one. She sat alone in the sterile interrogation room at the police station, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes betraying the sleepless nights that had followed Victor's death. Her mind was foggy, but her thoughts were clear. Everything she had worked for, the perfect marriage, the perfect life, was slipping away, unraveling before her eyes. The truth was out now. And there was no way to take it back. Detective Hayes sat across from her, his gaze unwavering. He was calm, methodical, and patient, but there was an intensity in his eyes that spoke volumes. He knew something wasn't right. He knew that the scene at the Grant house, Victor's body, the broken furniture, the bloodstains on the floor, told a story that didn't quite match the one Olivia had given him. Olivia, Detective Hayes began, his voice low and measured. I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night. From the beginning. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She hadn't been prepared for this. She hadn't been prepared for the questions that would tear apart everything she had tried to hide. Her mind flashed to Ethan, to their shared moments, their whispered conversations, their desperate, forbidden love. The weight of their secret felt heavier than ever now. But there was no turning back. I don't know where to start, Olivia's voice quivered. She tried to steady herself, but it was clear she was struggling to maintain control. Victor came home early. He had no reason to, but he did. He knew something was wrong. He started accusing Ethan and me. He was angry. And then, it all happened so fast. Her words tumbled out, fragmented and disjointed, as she recounted the events of that night, the confrontation, Victor's violent outburst, the chaos that followed. She spoke of the argument, of Victor's accusations, of Ethan's fear and rage. She even described the moment when Victor had fallen, the ashtray striking his skull, and how she had tried, desperately, to save him. But every word seemed hollow, like she was trying to convince herself that the tragedy was out of her control. Detective Hayes listened intently, taking notes, but his eyes never left her face. He wasn't convinced. "You're saying Victor attacked Ethan, and in the struggle, you were injured?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Olivia hesitated. "Yes," she replied, though doubt began to creep into her voice. She had rehearsed this story in her mind 1,000 times, but now, in the cold, sterile room, it felt like a lie she could no longer sustain. Victor, he was out of control. He was going to hurt Ethan. I had to stop him. The detective didn't respond immediately, letting the silence hang in the air. Olivia's eyes darted around the room, her mind whirling. She knew that her story had holes, that the pieces weren't adding up. But she had no choice but to keep telling it, keep playing the part of the grieving wife, the woman who had been a victim of a violent, unpredictable man. Meanwhile, forensic teams were digging through the evidence at the Grant house. Every inch of the property, every object, every word spoken was under scrutiny. The house was a stage, and the evidence was beginning to tell a different story than the one Olivia had spun. There were inconsistencies in her statements. Victor's autopsy revealed traces of a powerful sedative in his system, the same kind that had been used to incapacitate him earlier that evening. A toxicology report confirmed that Victor had been drugged, not just once, but over the course of several days, gradually weakening him. And then there were the emails and text messages. Detective Hayes and his team discovered a trail of hidden communications between Olivia and Ethan. The messages, innocuous at first, grew more intimate, more desperate. They were not the exchanges of a stepmother and stepson, they were the secret words of two people bound by a dangerous, forbidden desire. The messages detailed their affair, how it had started, how it had grown, how they had plotted together to rid themselves of Victor, to live a life free from his control. It was all there in black and white, the evidence of betrayal, of manipulation, and most damning of all, the plan to murder Victor. When the detective presented Olivia with the evidence, she felt her stomach drop. Her world, which had been carefully crafted in the shadows, was now crashing down around her. "You see, Olivia," Detective Hayes said, his voice soft but unyielding, "Victor didn't die in a fit of rage. He didn't attack anyone. He was drugged, by you, and he was killed by someone he trusted. By the people closest to him." The words cut through her like a knife. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. The truth had been laid bare. She had been a willing accomplice in her own destruction, a woman consumed by desire and resentment, and now there was no way to escape the consequences of her actions. Detective Hayes paused, watching her carefully. "Ethan confessed, Olivia. He told us everything. The affair, the plan, the murder." Her heart sank as the truth began to settle in. Ethan, the young man she had shared her darkest secrets with, the man she had thought of as her savior, had turned on her. She had betrayed him, and now he had done the same. The weight of it was unbearable. As the detective continued to speak, Olivia realized there was no way out. She was trapped in the web of lies she had created, and no amount of pleading or denial would change the fact that she was responsible for Victor's death. The truth had finally emerged, and with it, the certainty that her life, her carefully constructed life, was over. There would be no escaping the consequences of her choices. The investigation was far from over, but for Olivia, the damage had already been done. The consequences of her betrayal, her manipulation, and her murder were now unavoidable. And with each passing day, as the truth continued to unravel, Olivia could only wait for the inevitable. The trial was an inevitable consequence of the brutal truth that had come to light. Olivia sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain composure. The once perfect woman, wife, stepmother, socialite, was now a figure of scrutiny, her every word and gesture under the harsh spotlight of the legal system. Her face, once a mask of perfection, now appeared gaunt, her eyes hollow with the weight of the choices she had made. Across the room, Ethan sat quietly. He no longer looked like the rebellious young man who had walked into the Grant household a few years ago. The boy she had once shared secret, stolen moments with was now a young man burdened with the weight of guilt and remorse. They had both been trapped in a web of lies, spun by desire, manipulation, and desperation. But now, the consequences of their actions were undeniable, and they would have to face them, together, yet apart. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Olivia's role in Victor's murder. The affair between her and Ethan, their secret communications, and the evidence of premeditation were all laid bare for the courtroom to see. The prosecution argued that Olivia, in her pursuit of freedom and revenge, had carefully manipulated Ethan into participating in her plan to murder Victor, staging his death as a suicide to cash in on his life insurance policy. Olivia's defense, however, was a different story. Her lawyers argued that she had been a victim of years of abuse at the hands of her husband, Victor. They claimed that she had acted out of desperation, driven to the brink of madness by the suffocating control he had exerted over her. They painted her as a woman trapped in a toxic marriage, who had fallen victim to Ethan's advances, making her actions the result of years of emotional and psychological torment. But despite the defense's best efforts, the jury was not swayed. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Ethan, still deeply scarred by his father's abuse, testified about the affair, the plan, and the murder. His words were laced with guilt, his voice quivering as he recounted the events that had led to his father's death. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Ethan had been manipulated by Olivia, a pawn in her twisted game. But even with his confession, the reality of what had transpired between them was far too complex to be neatly categorized as simply an act of love gone wrong. As Olivia took the stand in her own defense, her testimony was a mixture of remorse and steely resolve. She admitted to the affair, to the manipulation, and to the murder, but she insisted that Victor's abuse had pushed her to the edge. She wept as she spoke of the years of control and mistreatment, but there was something in her eyes, a coldness, that suggested she was still clinging to the belief that she had done what was necessary to escape a life she could no longer bear. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Olivia broke down on the stand, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable as the woman who had once held the power in the Grant household was reduced to a shell of herself. The reality of her actions, of the lives she had destroyed, of the path she had chosen, was now impossible to deny. In the end, Olivia was found guilty of first-degree murder, with the jury recommending a life sentence without the possibility of parole. As the judge delivered the verdict, Olivia's face remained expressionless. She had known this day would come, but hearing the words spoken out loud felt like a final blow. The woman who had once dreamed of freedom was now bound by the very chains she had tried so desperately to escape. Ethan, too, was sentenced. His role in the murder was seen as one of manipulation and coercion, but he was still held accountable for his actions. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but his emotional turmoil was far from over. The guilt weighed heavily on him as he was led out of the courtroom, his eyes cast downward, ashamed of the choices he had made. As Olivia and Ethan were escorted away, the town of Maplewood was left to pick up the pieces. The once celebrated family, admired for their wealth and status, had been reduced to a cautionary tale of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. The perfect facade had crumbled, revealing the darkness that lay beneath. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with gossip. People whispered in hushed tones about the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. How could such a thing have happened in their quiet, idyllic town? But the truth was, it had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The tension, the manipulation, the deceit, it had all been there, lurking beneath the surface. But the story of Olivia and Ethan was far from over. As they sat in their cells, each prisoner alone with their thoughts, they were left to reflect on the lives they had ruined and the irreversible damage they had caused. The tragedy of the Grants would live on as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked desire, the consequences of manipulation, and the devastating effects of unresolved pain. But what happens when the desire for freedom outweighs the price of a life? Do you think Olivia was justified in her actions, or was she simply a woman driven by her own desperation? What would you have done in her shoes? Let us know what you think in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this chilling story and how it unfolds. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime tales like this one. Your opinion matters, and we want to hear from you.